You think you can just lie to me? Impersonating a public official is a felony, pal. You just dug your hole deeper.
Check my wallet. My credentials are right behind my driver's license. The gold badge. Check it.
Fuller, what did you do?
The air in the terminal hummed with the organized chaos of travel, a symphony of rolling suitcases, muffled announcements, and the faint, ever-present scent of coffee and anxiety. It was a river of humanity, and Leo Sterling was just another drop in the current. Dressed in a nondescript gray hoodie, worn in jeans and scuffed sneakers, he was the picture of collegiate anonymity. He shuffled forward in the security line, his shoulders slightly slouched, not from fatigue, but from a lifelong habit of trying to take up less space. The only thing that distinguished him from the hundreds of other travelers was the dense, heavy backpack slung over one shoulder, a bag that seemed to anchor him to the ground. He placed it carefully into a gray plastic bin, followed by a laptop that looked more like a ruggedized military case than a commercial device. As the bin slid into the mouth of the X-ray machine, Agent Mark Fuller watched his monitor, at 32. Fuller had the weary cynicism of a man who'd been in the job a decade too long. He saw the world in shades of threat and contraband. His eyes, accustomed to scanning for the familiar shapes of water bottles and pocket knives, narrowed. The image on his screen was an intricate spiderweb of wires, circuit boards, and dense, unidentifiable blocks of metal and silicon. It wasn't the usual jumble of a tourist's camera and a student's tablet. This was different. This was complex. He flagged the bin instantly. "Whose bag is this?" he called out, his voice cutting through the hum. Leo raised a hand. "Mine." Fuller looked him up and down. A slow, deliberate appraisal. The hoodie, the tired eyes, the backpack that looked like it weighed more than the young man carrying it. A familiar narrative began to form in his mind. Another tech bro with an attitude, he thought. Or worse. "We're going to need you to step aside for a secondary screening, sir," Fuller said. The "sir," a brittle piece of procedural formality. There was no request in his voice, only a command. Leo nodded, his expression unreadable. He had factored this into his timeline. He always did. He watched as another agent carefully carried the bin to a sterile stainless steel counter off to the side. A small island of scrutiny in the sea of transit. Fuller met him there, pulling on a pair of blue latex gloves with a sharp, definitive snap. The sound was a punctuation mark, the beginning of a new sentence in Leo's day. "What's in the bag?" Fuller asked, his hand hovering over the main zipper. "Electronics," Leo replied, his voice calm and even. "Sensitive equipment." Fuller let out a short, humorless laugh. "It's all sensitive equipment. Kid, let's have a look." He unzipped the bag with a rough tug. The contents were packed with a geometric precision that was almost jarring. Custom-cut foam held a dozen strange devices in place, small, hardened external drives, a cluster of what looked like modified routers, and several small antenna-studded black boxes. Each item was nestled in its own compartment, a testament to meticulous organization. Fuller's initial suspicion hardened into something more pointed. This wasn't just complex, it was professional. It was the kind of gear you didn't buy at a big box store. Before we delve deeper into this confrontation, a clash between casual prejudice and hidden brilliance that would have consequences far beyond this security checkpoint, I need you to do something for me. Take a moment and drop a comment below. Let me know where you're watching from. Are you tuning in from the United States, Australia, Germany? I want to know what part of the world you're in. And if you believe that true expertise doesn't always come in a suit and tie, and that judging someone by their appearance is a critical error, hit that subscribe button right now. You need to see how this unfolds, because the young man in the hoodie is about to teach Agent Fuller a lesson in security that he'll never forget. Fuller picked up one of the hardened drives. It was heavy, solid, with no branding. "What is this?" "It's a storage device," Leo said. "I need you to be careful with it." "I know what a hard drive is," Fuller snapped back, his tone dripping with condescension. "I'm asking what's on it." "Data." Fuller's jaw tightened. He hated one-word answers. He hated the calm, almost detached way the young man was watching him, as if Leo were an observer in his own shakedown. "You're going to have to be more specific than that. For security purposes." Leo hesitated for a fraction of a second. "The data is encrypted and classified." The word hung in the air between them. Classified. It was a word people threw around, a word they thought gave them an aura of importance. To Fuller, it was a red flag, a classic bluff from someone trying to hide something. He looked from the strange, dense hardware back to Leo's young face. He saw no signs of fear, no nervous tics, just a steady, unwavering gaze. This wasn't the behavior of a common smuggler. But it wasn't the behavior of an innocent traveler either. It was the composure of someone who believed they were untouchable, and Mark Fuller, in his small kingdom of X-ray machines and pat-downs, made it his business to touch them. He had no idea he was about to press his thumb against the most sensitive nerve in national security. He had no idea that the young man he was treating like a suspect was the very person his boss's bosses trusted to protect the nation's deepest secrets. The gears of a terrible, career-altering mistake were beginning to turn. The secondary screening area was a small, cold purgatory. Travelers who ended up here were stripped of their anonymity, their belongings laid bare under the flat, unforgiving fluorescent lights. For Leo, it was a familiar environment. He'd been pulled aside in airports from London to Tokyo, his gear always raising the same questions, but this felt different. There was an edge to Agent Fuller's demeanor, a personal investment in the outcome that went beyond professional duty. "So, classified data," Fuller repeated, turning one of the black boxes over in his hands. He tapped its casing with a gloved finger. "That's a big word for a guy in a hoodie. Where are you headed?" The question was standard, but the tone was anything but. It was the kind of question designed to catch someone in a lie. "Washington, D.C., Leo answered, his hands resting at his sides. He kept them visible, a habit ingrained from years of instruction from mentors who understood the optics of these situations. Don't make sudden moves, narrate your actions, stay calm. It was a survival script for people who carried the burdens of unusual professions. "And what's the purpose of your visit?" Fuller continued, his eyes scanning Leo, not the device in his hand. "Business or pleasure?" "I'm attending a conference," Leo stated simply. "A conference," Fuller echoed, a smirk playing on his lips. "What kind of conference needs all this?" He gestured vaguely at the array of high-tech equipment on the table. He was baiting him, trying to poke a hole in his story. Leo recognized the tactic. It was a low-level social engineering technique designed to provoke an emotional response, to make the subject defensive and more likely to slip up. Beneath Leo's calm exterior, a quiet calculation was taking place. He was assessing the agent, cataloging his behavior, his micro-expressions, the subtle shift in his posture. He saw a man who looked no older than his early 30s, with a military-style haircut that was starting to thin and eyes that held a deep-seated boredom. Fuller was operating on a script of his own, one written by years of repetitive work and the jaded belief that everyone had something to hide. He saw a young man with expensive, strange gear, and made an assumption based on 1,000 B-movies and news reports. He wasn't a public servant ensuring safety. He was a gatekeeper looking to exercise his authority. "It's a technology conference," Leo said, deliberately keeping his answer concise. He knew that offering too much information would only fuel the agent's suspicion. Every detail he provided would become another thread for Fuller to pull. Right? A technology conference? You some kind of gamer? Heading to a competition? The condescension was thicker now, a palpable thing. The question was designed to belittle him, to frame his serious equipment as elaborate toys. It was a way of seizing control of the narrative, painting Leo as a juvenile hobbyist, not a professional. Something like that, Leo replied. The ambiguity, a carefully chosen shield. Frustrated by the young man's unshakable composure, Fuller changed tactics. He set the device down and leaned against the steel table, crossing his arms. The posture was meant to be intimidating, a casual assertion of dominance. You know, we see a lot of people trying to move things through here they shouldn't. Unlicensed tech, prototypes stolen from their employers. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? The question was an accusation disguised as a hypothetical. It was unprofessional and irrelevant to the security screening. He was no longer screening for threats. He was fishing for a crime. All of this equipment is mine, Leo said, his voice dropping a fraction of a decibel. It wasn't a change born of anger, but of precision. And I have the proper authorization to travel with it. Authorization? Fuller scoffed. Everybody's got authorization until they don't. Let me see it. Leo met his gaze. The nature of the equipment is sensitive. The less it's handled, the better. The authorization is tied to my identity and my ticket. That's not how it works, Fuller lied. I'm the one who decides what goes through this checkpoint. And right now, I'm not satisfied with your answers. The agent was now operating entirely on ego. He had been challenged, albeit passively, and he couldn't stand it. He was used to nervousness, to deference, to people babbling explanations to placate him. Leo's quiet, factual resistance was like sandpaper on his pride. He saw it as defiance. He decided then and there that he was going to take this kid's entire setup apart, piece by piece. He had no idea that the equipment he was about to manhandle was not just sensitive. It was a cornerstone of a multi-million-dollar national security project. He had no idea that his casual disregard was about to constitute a breach of protocol so severe it would trigger alarms in buildings Leo wasn't even cleared to know existed. He was a man holding a match, convinced he had found a gas leak, entirely unaware he was standing in an ammunition depot. The sterile quiet of the screening area was broken by the clatter of metal on steel as Fuller dropped one of the custom hard drives onto the table. It landed with a heavy, final sound. Let's start with these, he said, his voice laced with a triumphant edge. You say they're encrypted. We have tech that can look into that. Leo's calm demeanor finally cracked, but only with a flicker of genuine concern. That's not a good idea, he said, his voice firm. Those drives are proprietary. They're designed to resist any form of unauthorized access. A forced scan could corrupt the data permanently. Fuller paused, his hand on the drive. For a split second, the technical specificity of the warning, corrupt the data permanently, gave him pause. Most people just said, "You can't do that." This kid sounded like he was reading from a manual, but his pride, now fully engaged in this battle of wills, quickly overrode his caution. That sounds like a personal problem, Fuller sneered. If you have nothing to hide, there's nothing to corrupt. It's standard procedure. It was not standard procedure. Leo knew it. Fuller almost certainly knew it too. TSA's role was to screen for physical threats, explosives, weapons. A deep-level data analysis on encrypted hard drives was the jurisdiction of other, far more serious federal agencies, and it required warrants, not the whim of a bored agent. Fuller was bluffing, using the implied power of his uniform to justify his overreach. He was punishing Leo for his composure, for not giving him the fear he felt he was owed. He picked up another device, a small, sealed unit with a single shielded port. "And what's this little beauty? A personal Wi-Fi hotspot?" "That is a dedicated decryption module," Leo stated, his eyes fixed on the agent's hands. "It is paired to the drives. Please, do not attempt to power it on." The warning was clear, direct, and devoid of emotion. It was the same tone a bomb disposal expert might use to say, "Don't cut the red wire." But to Fuller, it sounded like a challenge. He saw a kid trying to protect his secrets, and it made him more determined to expose them. A psychological phenomenon was at play, one often seen in positions of low-level authority, the sunk cost fallacy of confrontation. He had invested his ego in this stop. Backing down now would feel like a personal defeat, so he had to be right, which meant the kid had to be wrong. He turned the module over, looking for a power button. He saw a small, recessed switch under a protective plastic cover. "You know," Fuller said conversationally, his thumb flicking open the cover, "the more you tell me not to do something, the more I think I should." "Agent," Leo said, and his voice was now ice. It was the voice of a man who had briefed generals and advised intelligence directors. It was a voice that commanded attention in rooms where decisions of global importance were made. "That device contains a cryptographic key. If it is powered on and does not detect its paired hardware in a secure environment, it is designed to wipe itself. That process is irreversible and will render several $1 million of research and development completely useless. You are currently holding a self-destruct button." Fuller froze. The words, cryptographic key, wipe itself, several $1 million, were so specific, so far beyond the usual excuses he heard, that they momentarily broke through his wall of cynicism. He looked at the device, then at Leo. The young man's face was a mask of deadly seriousness, but the seed of doubt was choked out by the weed of pride. There was no way. This scruffy kid in a hoodie talking about millions of dollars. It was absurd. It had to be a lie, a desperate, elaborate bluff to protect whatever was really on those drives. He saw the faces of other travelers in the main security line, their curiosity piqued by the confrontation. He felt the eyes of his colleagues on him. If he backed down now, he would be a laughingstock. "He called my bluff," Fuller thought. "Gotta see it through." "Nice try," he scoffed, his voice a little too loud, a little too forced. "You've been watching too many spy movies." With a defiant smirk, he pressed the button. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a tiny LED on the device flashed red once, then went dark. A faint, almost imperceptible warmth spread through the casing. Fuller held it up, shaking it slightly. "See? Nothing. Just another one of your stories." He was cut off by the sound of a supervisor's voice, sharp and laced with urgency. "Fuller, what in God's name do you think you're doing?" Fuller looked up, startled. His shift supervisor, a portly, balding man named Davies, was storming toward them, his face pale with a mixture of anger and panic. The game was over. The real world had just crashed the party. Supervisor Davies arrived at the screening table like a storm front, his eyes wide with a dawning horror that Agent Fuller couldn't yet comprehend. "I said, what are you doing?" Davies repeated, his voice low and tight with fury. His gaze flickered from the inert decryption module in Fuller's hand to the array of specialized equipment on the table, and then finally to Leo's grim, unmoving face. "Just a routine secondary, sir," Fuller said, trying to regain his footing. His bravado was beginning to feel thin and brittle. "This passenger has a bag full of suspicious unmarked electronics, and he's being uncooperative, refusing to state the nature of his business, claiming his gear is classified." He said the last word with a mocking inflection, hoping for validation from his superior. He received none. Davies ignored him completely and addressed Leo directly, his tone respectful, almost deferential. "Sir, has this agent attempted to operate any of your equipment?" The shift in tone was jarring. The use of "sir" was genuine, not the sarcastic formality Fuller had employed. "He just activated the failsafe on that decryption key," Leo said, his voice flat and devoid of accusation. He was merely stating a fact, like a doctor noting a time of death. Davies closed his eyes for a long moment, as if bracing for a physical impact. When he opened them, the panic had been replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He turned to Fuller. "Did he just say you activated a failsafe?" Fuller's face was a canvas of confusion. "It was a bluff. Davies, the kid was giving me a story about millions of dollars in self-destructing data to keep me from looking. I called him on it, see?" He held up the lifeless module. Nothing happened. "You catastrophic idiot," Davies whispered, the words so venomous they seemed to suck the air out of the space around them. "Nothing happened visibly. You don't have the clearance to understand what you just did." He snatched the device from Fuller's hand, holding it as if it were a dead bird. He turned back to Leo. "On behalf of the Transportation Security Administration, I apologize, sir. We will handle this internally." Fuller stood stunned, his mind struggling to process the scene. Davies was apologizing? To the kid in the hoodie? "Handle what?" Fuller demanded, his voice rising. "I was doing my job. This guy fits a profile. He could be anyone. A corporate spy, a hacker." "He is not just a hacker," Leo interrupted. Speaking for the first time since Davies arrived, he had decided the time for quiet compliance was over. He had given Agent Fuller every opportunity to de-escalate, to follow procedure, to simply do his job correctly. That time had passed. Agent Fuller has not only violated TSA protocols on handling sensitive electronics, but he has also just actively destroyed United States government property. Fuller laughed, a harsh, nervous sound. "Government property? Right. And I suppose you're a secret agent?" "Mark, shut your mouth now," Davies commanded, his face turning a blotchy red. But Fuller couldn't stop. He was on a runaway train of his own making. The absurdity of his supervisor's reaction, the sheer impossibility that this young man was, who he now seemed to be, caused his brain to reject the information. It was a defense mechanism. Admitting he was wrong now meant admitting to a mistake of cataclysmic proportions. "No. I want to hear this," Fuller said, pointing a shaking finger at Leo. "You're claiming this junk is government property? You think that lie is going to get you out of this? Impersonating a federal employee is a felony. Pal, you just dug yourself a hole you will not believe." He took a step toward Leo, puffing out his chest. He was doubling down, tripling down, betting his entire career on the single belief that this kid was a fraud. He wanted to humiliate him, to make him stand on the side of the concourse while they waited for airport police. He wanted to exert control one last time. Leo looked at him, not with anger, but with a kind of weary pity. He saw the rage and the fear behind the agent's eyes. He saw a man who had built his identity on a small pedestal of authority, and that pedestal was crumbling beneath his feet. "Officer," Leo said, his voice calm and steady, "I suggest you stop talking. There is no need for this to escalate further." "I'll decide what escalates," Fuller shouted. The command hung in the air, drawing the attention of everyone within earshot. "You are being detained, pending the arrival of law enforcement. For your safety, I need you to place your hands behind your back." The order was preposterous. A TSA agent had no authority to arrest or detain in that manner. It was a desperate, flailing attempt to regain control, but the threat was real. Fuller's hand drifted toward the radio on his belt. The woman behind him in line, a businesswoman in a sharp suit, had her phone out, recording. Good. Witnesses. "I am not consenting to this," Leo stated clearly for the camera. "Agent Fuller is acting outside of his authority. I fear for my safety if I do not comply." He didn't move. He stood his ground, waiting for the agent to make the final, irrevocable error. He had no idea just how deep the hole he had dug for Fuller was about to become. The standoff was a tableau of crumbling authority. Agent Fuller, red-faced and trembling with a mixture of rage and adrenaline, Supervisor Davies, frozen in horror, understanding the disaster unfolding in slow motion, and Leo, the calm eye of the storm. The curious stares of other passengers felt like spotlights. "I'm not going to ask you again," Fuller said, his voice strained. "You are interfering with a security screening. That's a federal offense." "You are no longer conducting a security screening." "Agent Fuller," Leo replied, his tone as cool and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. "You are conducting a personal vendetta because your assumptions about me were incorrect. You have damaged sensitive equipment, ignored the warnings of your supervisor, and are now attempting an unlawful detention. Every action you take from this point forward is your own." The legalistic precision of the statement seemed to stun Fuller for a moment. Most people just shouted about their rights in a vague, panicked way. This kid sounded like he was reading an indictment. It was the same cognitive dissonance Officer Miller felt when Evelyn Vance spoke of qualified immunity. But just like Miller, Fuller's pride was a fortress. In his mind, he couldn't be wrong. Therefore, this kid had to be lying. A very, very good liar, but a liar nonetheless. "Yeah, you talk a good game, I'll give you that," Fuller sneered, recovering his bluster. "Where'd you learn all that? Law school? You can tell your whole story to the cops." He reached for his radio. Davies finally snapped out of his paralysis. "Mark, if you make that call, you're fired before you even finish the sentence. Stand down." "That is a direct order." Fuller hesitated, his hand hovering over the radio. He looked at his supervisor, then back at Leo. He was trapped. Obeying Davies meant admitting defeat. Calling the cops meant betting his entire career on his gut instinct. His gut, which had been so certain just minutes ago, was now a roiling sea of doubt. It was in that moment of hesitation that Leo decided to end the charade. He had collected enough data. "That won't be necessary," Leo said quietly. He reached into the front pocket of his hoodie, moving slowly and deliberately. Fuller tensed. "Hands where I can see them." "I'm getting my identification," Leo said, his voice placid. "As you requested." He pulled out a worn leather wallet. He didn't open it. Instead, he reached into another pocket of his backpack, the one Fuller hadn't bothered to search, and retrieved a single, crisp manila envelope. It was sealed with a dark blue stamp that was immediately recognizable to anyone in government circles. The eagle and shield of the Department of Defense. He held it out for Fuller to see. "You wanted to know the purpose of my visit to Washington," Leo said. "You wanted to see my authorization. Here it is." Fuller stared at the envelope. His brain tried to dismiss it. It had to be a prop, a fake, a really good fake. "I'm not looking at anything you pull out of your bag," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "You can give that to the responding officers." "I don't think they'll be necessary," Leo said, "and I don't think you want them to be." He unclasped the envelope and slid out a single sheet of heavy bond paper. It wasn't a cheap printout. It was an official letter, embossed with a government seal at the top. He held it up so Fuller could read it. The text was stark and unambiguous. It was a formal letter of invitation. It began, "Dear Mr. Sterling, on behalf of the Office of the Secretary of Defense, We formally invite you to be the keynote speaker at the annual Joint Cyber Operations Symposium. Fuller's eyes scanned the words, but his brain refused to assemble them into a coherent meaning. He saw the name Leo Sterling. He saw the phrases leading civilian expert, threat mitigation, and national security. And then he saw the signature at the bottom. It was a name he recognized, a four-star general who was frequently on the news, the head of U.S. Cyber Command. The weight of it, the sheer undeniable authenticity of the seal, the letterhead, the signature. It was like a physical blow. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through his anger. He looked from the letter to Leo's calm, patient face. He looked at the ruined decryption module on the table. He looked at Davies, who was now just shaking his head slowly, a look of profound disappointment on his face. The world tilted on its axis. He was the fool. He was the one who had been wrong, spectacularly, career-endingly wrong. But his ego had one last, desperate defense mechanism. Denial. "It's a fake," he whispered, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "A very good fake. Where did you get this printed?" The question was pathetic. It was the last gasp of a man drowning in his own mistake. Leo didn't even bother to answer. He simply folded the letter, slid it back into the envelope, and looked at Supervisor Davies. "I believe we're done here," he said. The silence that followed Fuller's pathetic accusation was heavier than any shout could have been. It was the sound of a career evaporating. Supervisor Davies stepped forward, physically placing himself between his agent and Leo, a human shield against any further stupidity. "Mark," Davies said, his voice a low growl of finality, "go to my office. Sit down. Do not talk to anyone. Do not touch a computer. We are done here." "But the letter," Fuller began, his voice cracking. "The letter is real, you moron!" Davies roared, finally losing his composure. The shout echoed in the cavernous space. "You think the Pentagon sends out joke invitations? That's Leo Sterling. He briefs the Joint Chiefs. He designed the encryption architecture for half the intelligence community. The gear you just manhandled and broke is probably worth more than your entire house." The color drained from Fuller's face. He looked like a ghost, his skin a pasty white under the fluorescent lights. The name, Leo Sterling, meant nothing to him, but the context, the sheer apoplectic rage on his supervisor's face, told him everything he needed to know. The kid wasn't a suspect. He was an asset, a vital one. Fuller stumbled back a step, bumping into the steel table. The clatter of the electronics he had handled so cavalierly a moment ago now sounded like an accusation. He looked at Leo, truly looked at him for the first time, not as a stereotype in a hoodie, but as the man his supervisor was describing. He saw the intelligence in his calm eyes, the quiet confidence that he had mistaken for arrogance. The entire encounter replayed in his mind, but this time from a terrifying new perspective. Every calm answer, every patient warning he had received wasn't defiance. It was an act of profound restraint. Leo hadn't been fighting him. He had been trying to save him from himself. Davies was already on his radio, his voice urgent and clipped. "Davies to control. I have a code 7 at Checkpoint Bravo. I need the terminal director and a representative from Airport Police Liaison here immediately. Expedite." A code 7. Fuller's stomach dropped. That was the code for a significant security breach or incident involving a high-priority individual. He had never heard it used in his entire career. Officers who had been watching the scene from a distance now began to converge, not with aggression, but with a wary official curiosity. They saw their colleague, Fuller, pale and trembling. They saw their supervisor, Davies, looking like he was about to have a heart attack. And they saw the young man in the gray hoodie, standing perfectly still, the calm center of the chaos he had inadvertently caused. The terminal director, a stern woman in a sharp blazer, arrived within 3 minutes, flanked by 2 uniformed police officers. Her name was Ms. Albright, a woman known for her zero-tolerance policy on incompetence. "Davies, report," she said, her eyes already assessing the situation. "Ma'am," Davies began, his voice strained. "Agent Fuller, acting against my direct observation and standard protocol, initiated an unwarranted and aggressive secondary screening on Mr. Leo Sterling." He paused, letting the name hang in the air. Albright's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. She knew the name. An alert had come through a week ago. A discreet memo about a VIP traveling through their terminal. To be afforded every courtesy. A memo Fuller had clearly either not read or not connected to the young man in front of him. "Mr. Sterling," Albright said, turning to Leo and extending a hand. Her demeanor was a complete 180 from the confrontation moments before. "I am the director of this terminal. I cannot apologize enough for the unprofessional conduct of my agent. Is your equipment damaged?" "One component has been rendered inoperable," Leo said, shaking her hand briefly. "It's a significant setback, but it can be rectified. The larger issue is the breakdown in protocol that led to this." He wasn't angry. He was analytical. He was already diagnosing the failure. Albright nodded, her expression grim. "I assure you, a full investigation will be launched immediately. Agent Fuller is being placed on administrative leave as we speak." She turned her gaze to Fuller, and it was like being hit with a blast of Arctic air. "Fuller, your badge and your airport ID, now!" His hands shook so badly he could barely unclip the badge from his belt. He fumbled with the lanyard around his neck, the plastic credentials that had given him his authority, his power, now felt like a lead weight. He placed them on the table next to the very equipment he had belittled. Without them, he looked smaller, younger. He was just a 32-year-old man who had followed a bad assumption off a cliff. "Go with these officers," Albright commanded. "They will escort you to the administrative building. Do not leave the premises." As 2 officers quietly led the now silent Mark Fuller away, Leo watched him go. There was no triumph in his victory. There was only a quiet, profound sense of disappointment. A system he was being paid to protect had just failed, not because of a foreign adversary or a sophisticated piece of malware, but because of a simple, predictable human flaw. With Agent Fuller escorted away, a frantic, almost surreal ballet of damage control began. The atmosphere at the checkpoint shifted from tense confrontation to solicitous apology. What was a secondary screening table a moment ago was now treated like a diplomatic incident zone. "Mr. Sterling, please," Director Albright said, her voice a study in professional contrition. "Let's move you and your equipment to a private room. We'll have our top technicians see if there's anything that can be done." "That won't be necessary," Leo said calmly. "And with all due respect, your technicians are not cleared to handle this equipment, powered on or off. I'll take care of it." His statement was not arrogant, just factual. It drew a clear line between their capabilities and his, gently reminding them of the chasm in clearance and expertise that Fuller had so spectacularly failed to recognize. Supervisor Davies, still looking shaken, carefully began placing the devices back into their foam-cut slots in the backpack. He handled each piece as if it were an unexploded bomb. "I am so sorry, sir," Davies mumbled as he worked. "Mark, he gets cynical. He sees so much." "He saw what he expected to see," Leo finished for him. Not unkindly. "Confirmation bias. It's one of the most common vulnerabilities in any security system." The clinical diagnosis of the situation seemed to calm Davies slightly. It moved the incident from the realm of personal failure into a more abstract, systemic problem. Leo zipped up his backpack and slung it over his shoulder. "I'm going to miss my flight," he stated, looking at the departures board. The flight to TSA was now boarding. "Absolutely not," Albright said immediately. "We're holding the plane. Please, allow me to escort you to the gate personally." The offer was both a courtesy and a desperate attempt to keep him from placing a call that could make this an even bigger nightmare for them. The idea of the head of U.S. Cyber Command getting a call that his keynote speaker was being harassed by the TSA was enough to make a career politician like Albright break into a cold sweat. What followed was a bizarre reversal of fortune. Leo, who had been treated as a suspect just 10 minutes prior, was now the center of a VIP escort. Director Albright walked briskly in front of him, clearing a path through the crowds with a quiet authority. Supervisor Davies walked beside him, carrying his laptop case as if it were the nuclear football. 2 airport police officers followed at a discreet distance, acting as a security detail. People in the terminal stared. They saw the entourage and assumed he was a celebrity, a politician, someone of immense importance. They weren't wrong, but they could never have guessed the nature of that importance. The same people who had watched him being pulled aside with suspicion now looked at him with awe and curiosity. The journey to the gate was a walk of shame for the airport's management and a surreal lesson in optics for Leo. He passed other TSA agents who averted their eyes, their faces a mixture of fear and embarrassment. The news was already spreading through the ranks like wildfire. Some agent at Bravo checkpoint messed with a VIP from the Pentagon, a big one. When they arrived at the gate, the airline staff was waiting, holding the door open. The passengers already on board were looking out the windows, annoyed and curious about the delay. "Mr. Sterling, we have your seat ready in first class," the gate agent said, her smile a little too bright. "My ticket is for coach," Leo said, not as a protest, but as a statement of fact. "We've taken the liberty of upgrading you," Albright insisted. "It's the very least we can do." Leo simply nodded. He knew arguing would only prolong the uncomfortable ordeal. He wanted to be on the plane, in his seat, with his headphones on. He wanted to close his eyes and process the data from the last hour. He turned to Albright before boarding. "Director," he said, his voice low enough for only her and Davies to hear. "Agent Fuller's behavior was a symptom, not the disease. His file will show a pattern. I guarantee it. You can fire him, and you should. But if you don't address the culture that allowed him to feel comfortable acting that way, this will happen again. Next time, it might not be me. It might be someone without a letter from the Pentagon to save them. And that is a security failure I can't fix for you." Albright looked him in the eye. The kid who looked like he could be her son was giving her a piece of professional advice more valuable than anything she'd heard in a month of management seminars. "I understand," she said, and for the first time, her voice sounded completely genuine. "Your point is taken. Mr. Sterling, it will be addressed." Leo boarded the plane. As he walked down the aisle to his spacious first-class seat, he felt the eyes of the other passengers on him. They saw the VIP treatment, the fawning officials. They saw the result, but they had not seen the cause. They saw a young man being shown respect, but they hadn't seen him being threatened and humiliated for the crime of not fitting a narrow, preconceived notion of what success and importance looked like. He settled into his seat, the soft leather a stark contrast to the hard plastic chair of the secondary screening area. The flight attendant offered him a pre-departure drink. He just asked for a water. The door to the aircraft closed. As the plane pushed back from the gate, Leo looked out the window at the sprawling terminal. It was just a building, a node in a massive network. And like any network, its greatest vulnerability wasn't in its firewalls or its hardware, it was in the people who ran it. The flight to Washington, D.C. was smooth and uneventful for 3 hours. Leo Sterling sat in the quiet hum of the first-class cabin, the world slipping by 30,000 feet below. He didn't watch a movie or listen to music. He opened his ruggedized laptop, the one Supervisor Davies had carried so carefully, and began to type. He wasn't filing a complaint or drafting an angry email. He was rewriting the introduction to his keynote speech. The incident at the airport was no longer a personal annoyance, a frustrating delay. It had become something far more valuable, a perfect, real-world, teachable moment. It was raw data, a case study in the most dangerous variable in any security system, the human element. He arrived at the conference hotel, a gleaming monolith of glass and steel where the nation's top military and civilian cybersecurity experts were gathering. When he checked in, the organizers greeted him with an almost reverential respect. They saw Leo Sterling, the prodigy who had identified a critical flaw in the global banking network at the age of 22. The quiet genius the NSA and DARPA had on speed dial. They saw the expert who could think like the enemy, who could find the single hairline crack in the most fortified digital wall. They did not see a young man in a hoodie who, just a few hours earlier, had been threatened and belittled by a man who couldn't tell a decryption key from a flash drive. The two realities existed in a state of jarring contradiction. The next morning, Leo stood backstage, waiting to be introduced. He had swapped his hoodie and jeans for a simple dark suit and an open-collared shirt, his one concession to the formality of the event. He could hear the murmur of the crowd, hundreds of the brightest minds in his field. In the front row sat the top brass, generals, admirals, and high-level officials from the Department of Homeland Security. The man who introduced him, a 3-star general from Cyber Command, listed his accomplishments in a tone of deep admiration. As Leo walked onto the stage, a large screen behind him lit up with the title of his presentation, The Human Vector, Exploiting the Gaps Between Policy and Prejudice. He began not with talk of code or zero-day exploits, but with a story. Yesterday morning, he said, his calm voice filling the auditorium, I was detained at a TSA checkpoint. An agent saw a young man in a hoodie with a backpack full of complex electronics, and his mind filled in the blanks. He saw a threat profile that he had been conditioned to look for. A ripple of surprise went through the audience. This was not the opening they expected. He conducted a search that deviated from protocol, driven by his own cognitive biases. He ignored my warnings, which he perceived as the lies of a guilty party, and in his attempt to assert his authority, he physically destroyed a critical piece of government hardware. He paused, letting the words sink in. He could see expressions of shock and anger on the faces in the front row. That agent is the most dangerous kind of security flaw. He is a human vector. He is a walking, talking vulnerability that can't be patched with a software update. He wasn't bribed by a foreign power. He wasn't a malicious insider. His failure was simpler and far more common. He was a man whose ego and prejudice overrode his training. He clicked a remote, and a new slide appeared. It was a simple diagram showing a fortified network. We spend billions building walls like this, he said, gesturing to the screen. Firewalls, encryption, multi-factor authentication. But all of it, every last dollar, is predicated on the assumption that the people standing guard at the gates are making rational, unbiased decisions. The agent yesterday was not a guard. He was an open door. His bias created a vulnerability. In my case, it resulted in a damaged piece of equipment and a significant delay. But what if my purpose had been more time-sensitive? What if I had been responding to an active cyber attack? His simple human error could have had national security implications. For the next hour, he held the audience captivated, He used his experience as a framework to discuss how ingrained biases, ego, and a lack of critical thinking were as dangerous as any piece of malware. He proposed new training models, based on behavioral psychology, to help security personnel recognize and override their own prejudices. He transformed his personal humiliation into a powerful, impersonal lesson. The system had failed, and he was offering them a way to fix it. When he finished, the silence was followed by a thunderous, sustained standing ovation. He had given them more than a technical brief. He had given them a warning and a solution, a mirror that forced them to look at the weakest link in their own armor: themselves. The story of Leo Sterling and Agent Mark Fuller concludes with a clear victory, but it leaves us with a haunting and vital question. The system corrected itself, but only because Leo Sterling was who he was. He had the letter, the knowledge, and the invisible armor of his high-level connections. Justice, in this case, was a function of privilege. But what happens when the person in the hoodie doesn't have a direct line to the Pentagon? What happens when it's a brilliant, self-taught programmer from a poor neighborhood, a student with a bag full of parts for their university robotics project, or simply an innocent traveler who happens to look different? Justice shouldn't require a keynote speech at a government conference to be activated. It should be the default setting. To understand how to prevent a situation like this, we must first understand the psychology of Agent Fuller. He wasn't necessarily an evil man, but a product of a flawed system and his own internal biases. Imagine years of repetitive work, scanning thousands of bags a day. You're trained to look for patterns, for anomalies. Over time, your brain creates shortcuts. This is called confirmation bias. Fuller saw a young man in a hoodie, a visual cliché for a hacker or a troublemaker, and his brain immediately sought evidence to confirm that initial judgment. Leo's calm, intelligent answers didn't fit the guilty script, so Fuller interpreted them not as signs of innocence, but as evidence of cunning defiance. His ego became entwined with his initial assessment. To admit he was wrong about Leo would be to admit his finely honed instincts, his professional judgment, were flawed. This cognitive dissonance led him to double down, to escalate the situation in a desperate attempt to prove his initial theory correct. He wasn't just searching a bag, he was defending his own worldview. So, how could this have been mitigated? What if Leo had immediately presented the letter from the Department of Defense? The confrontation would have ended instantly. He could have saved himself the trouble, the anxiety, and the damaged equipment, but in doing so, the underlying vulnerability, Agent Fuller's behavior, would have remained undetected, ready to snare the next person who didn't have a magic letter. Leo's decision to let the situation play out, to calmly collect data on the system's failure, was in itself an act of service. He endured the personal discomfort to diagnose the disease. For those of us without high-level clearance, the lesson is more nuanced. If you find yourself in a similar situation where an authority figure is operating on bias, the Evelyn Vance method is key. Remain calm, be clear and concise, narrate your actions, and do not consent to anything you believe is unlawful. If possible, ensure there are witnesses. The presence of a recording phone can be a powerful de-escalation tool. The goal is not to win the argument in the moment, but to create an unimpeachable record of the encounter for later. Leo's story is a potent reminder that the greatest threats to a secure and just society often come not from sophisticated external attacks, but from the simple, timeless, and dangerous flaws within the human heart. We must build systems that account for this. Systems that have checks and balances against the quiet creep of prejudice and the loud roar of a fragile ego. This story was a heavy one, but an important one. If it made you think, please, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let's keep this vital conversation going. Do you think Agent Fuller's firing was a sufficient outcome? Or does the problem run deeper? What would you have done if you were in Leo's shoes? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge our perspectives and shine a light on the truth. Stay safe and stay vigilant.